Hi, my name's Robert Mealy. I'm the co-director of Quicksilver, and I just wanted to welcome you to our concert that's coming up and to talk a little bit about the wonderful, rich, and strange repertoire that we'll be playing. One way in to think about a lot of the 17th century especially is, I think, from that wonderful quote from the Edwardian novelist L.P. Hartley. He says in his novel The Go-Between, he says, it starts, "The past is another country. They do things differently there." And I think this phrase is kind of at the heart of all that we're up to with historical performance in general. We're trying to discover a kind of ethnomusicology of the past, where we try to find those things that might seem familiar and recognizable to us, but also be aware of just how much this music is distant from us, and sometimes to make the familiar into something less familiar. To use the German words, instead of making this foreign country into something heimlich or familiar, instead to make it unheimlich or uncanny, surprising, strange and wonderful. You might call this the unheimlich maneuver even. And this is particularly true for the music of the 17th century, which is so different from the balanced architecture of 18th century music. Historians call this period the early modern period, which I really like as a term because it implies that it's both early, it's far away from us, but also extremely modern. And this idea of modernity is really at the heart of the 17th century explorations in Viennese chamber music, which is what we're presenting. So our music is centered around the court of Vienna, which in the 17th century was really the place where the latest Italian music was heard. It's really the conduit for Italian music into the German culture. And so it's also the place where German composers are coming to terms with this new style, and they're discovering how to create their own versions of this music in their own particular musical language. And this all relates to this new kind of instrumental writing which evolves in the 17th century, which really is answering the question of how to construct extended pieces that don't have any kind of template. You don't have a text, you don't have dance form. What do you do as an instrumental composer? So the guiding principle behind all this is, in the 17th century, that instead of music being a science of counterpoint, a math like astronomy or geometry, it's now a discourse, it's a conversation, and like all conversations, it's organized as a series of rhetorical strategies. And these conversations in music, these dialogues, can be a way of structuring a new kind of instrumental form, and that's the sonata, which just means something to be sounded. And you'll notice that almost all our pieces tonight simply have this title. Composers discovered that this could be a really fascinating way of creating a discourse in music, which is only organized by rhetorical gestures, and it becomes a kind of wordless conversation. The Germans were fascinated by this. Some theorists of the time described the particular thing that happens in Germany as being in the stilus fantasticus, the fantastic style, because the Germans really take this idea and run with it. Their proportions become much larger, the pieces become much more theatrical. And this name of the stilus fantasticus is often used to describe a lot of the things that are going on in these sonatas. Athanasius Kircher, the great Jesuit polymath, he's a fantastic and extraordinary figure, one of the stranger figures in a very strange century. He said that the stilus fantasticus, quote, is the most free and unrestrained method of composition. It's organized with regard to manifest invention, the hidden reason of harmony, and an ingenious, skilled connection of harmonic phrases and fugues. And this effect, this very free style, continues right into the beginning of the 18th century. Johann Mattheson, the German theorist and composer, who is a colleague of Handel's, he writes in his Vollkommener Kapellmeister that these pieces in the Stilus Fantasticus follow all kinds of otherwise unusual progressions, hidden ornaments, ingenious turns and embellishments, not following a strict observation of the time signature of the key, regardless of what's written on the page. Now swift, now hesitating, now in one voice, now in many voices, but all this with the intent to please, to overwhelm, and to astonish. Those are very cool words. And I think this desire to astonish and to delight is really at the heart of these German sonatas that we'll be playing. The Viennese sonatas that really take as their model the Venetian sonatas of the early 17th century, but as I say, they transform the proportions, they complicate the game, they make all these sonatas far more lavish and theatrical. And this emerges in very interesting ways. One thing about this genre that I find very, very telling is that there are often these elaborate solo episodes in the middle of what seems to be an ensemble sonata. And you'd think these moments would seem to be the most free of all, lavish and virtuoso passage work. But what I've always found striking about them is that often these solos are then repeated identically by another instrument. So they serve both as a rhetorical function of creating a solo for an individual moment of monologue, but they also serve a kind of architectural function. So they're both highly individual and highly symmetrical, and it's very characteristic of Baroque art as much as music's, and I find it interesting parallel to have this in the pieces themselves. Now, because this was such a new and abstract form, some people found this very hard to deal with, just the same way people find abstract art to be somewhat baffling. There's a famous line by the French intellectual Fontenelle, who, when these sonatas first came to Paris in the late 17th century, he says, "Sonade, que me veux-tu? What do you want of me? What am I supposed to make of you? You're not a dance. You're not a fugue. There's no visible organizational principle. It's just a series of fantastic events." So that's interesting. The one thing that starts happening in Germany as this style gets amplified and diffused through Germany is that the Germans try to make sense of it. They try to give an account of it. Italians never write about this style, particularly after Caccini, his first treatise. But thereafter, we get very little in the 17th century from Italians about the actual nuts and bolts of the music. Germans they're dealing with a new and imported style, so they really analyze it. And the way they analyze it, as I mentioned already, is really through rhetoric. And some of these German writers really try to make a parallel between the sonatas and the construction of an oration itself, with an opening exordium, where you call your listeners to attention, a presentation of the ideas in musical language. That could be where a theme is discussed among all the players. And then you find alternative points of view. This could be a section in a different meter, different thematic points that are tossed around. And finally, a grand summing up, or peroratio, as it's called. And I find sometimes this is helpful to think about sonatas, but what I find actually most helpful about these theorists in coming to terms with this music is actually not this macro level of construction, but the much more micro level of exploring the fact that they really saw that this music is made up of small, intensely vivid rhetorical gestures, just the same way that a memorable speech is made up of eloquent turns of phrase. And this is really, I think, the key to so much 17th century music, and especially a key to instrumental music, where, of course, we have the drawback of trying to construct a discourse without words. All we have are the notes on the page. And that's a really powerful tool. Right? For us as Quicksilver, we find again and again that a piece, at first reading, it seems to be merely interesting, but then it actually becomes very powerful when we all commit to the power of its gestures, when we make them as eloquent and as vivid as possible, and when we really try to make the music speak and dance and sing, to come to life. So that's really actually where the name of our group comes from. We chose the name Quicksilver because it seems so appropriate for this extraordinary world of the 17th century. It describes the quicksilver changes of mood and tempo that are such a characteristic feature of these, especially German sonatas. And it's also the name for the alchemical material mercury, which transforms things magically the same way music transforms us all. And of course, alchemy is one of the arts that is most, particularly in the early 17th century, it's something that is absolutely fascinating to intellectuals throughout Europe. And it's not just the idea that you're going to be able to suddenly turn lead into gold, but actually it's a much more encompassing idea that you're actually transforming yourself from lead into potential gold. So it's the sense that things can really change and become something that they were not. And this could happen through music. And what I find fascinating is that a lot of the accounts of these pieces that we have don't really talk about the structure of the pieces at all, but they really talk about the effect the music has on people. And I think one of the best examples of this comes again from Athanasius Kircher, from his great volume on music called Musica Universalis from 1650. And here he talks about a performance of a sonata. He says, they began a symphony which was arranged for 2 small violins and that type of lute which they term a theorbo, with such a concord of harmony and so unusual divisions of unaccustomed intervals that I confess, although I had investigated some extraordinary things in music, I could not remember that I'd ever perceived something similar. It could scarcely be related how much they excited the soul's emotion with the unaccustomed mixture of different styles. When descending through the octave from a high into a low sound, they finished the passage gradually more languid. In this manner they affected the spirit of the listener with a manifest languor. And in their ascent, just like being awakened from a manifestly deep sleep, suddenly I know not to what lofty heights they stimulated the listener. Now I saw how they would seem to agitate the spirit by the leaping strings, even with a subtle motion of the bow, sometimes with the somewhat sorrowful discontent of low murmuring. They aroused the emotion to I know not what sorrow and sadness. You would have said that you had been present at a tragic scene. Afterwards, directly following an unexpected modulation, they would ravish the spirit gradually out of its relaxations into the thick, intense, and full chromaticism of happiness, and dance with such force that it could hardly be missed. Immediately into I know not what tumultuous fullness of powerful ferocity. As they were recovering their strength, they incited the soul to wars and battles, and finally, with relaxed momentum, they moved the spirit into I know not what character of sweeter affection, to compassion, divine love, and thus by this very incomparable symphony, my soul was ravished by a certain exotic emotion into the miraculous harmony of the celestial orbs. All in all, I had discovered that this intense harmony sounded together was a way to preserve the universe. So that's a lot. We can't promise the preservation of the universe in our Quicksilver concert, but we can try to echo the distant music of the spheres in this music, and we hope bring you delight and wonder through these pieces we love so much. Thank you.